What was the hardest piece of news you've had to tell someone? I worked as a pediatric psychology fellow while in graduate school. PhD clinical psychology. This invoked providing psychological services for all children in the hospital. One of my very first weeks I was shadowing a more experienced fellow and we encountered a family whose child, 7-year-old female, was hospitalized after she was in a car accident with her father. Her father died in the accident and no one in her family was comfortable directly explaining this to the child. They had used a lot of religious euphemisms about death. He's watching over you in heaven, he's with you in spirit, but this language is not concrete enough for a young child who doesn't really understand death. Sitting with this child, body brace, lacerations all over, very flat affect, and explaining to her what death was, that her father had died, and having to ask questions to make sure she understood was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my graduate training. I can still vividly imagine her face while we were telling her and the tears silently rolling down her face. I had to tell my boyfriend his best friend was the body found in the river after he had been missing for 2 days. Had to call my girlfriend parents at 1 a.m. to tell them there was a bad accident, that their daughter was en route to ER and I thought she would be okay. She died on arrival. Worst day of my life. Had to call my brother, sisters, and mother when I found my father dead. After calling 911 and my wife. Telling someone's family that we are giving up on searching for their loved ones who are lost at sea. To tell my mom her husband had been molesting me for multiple years and that I wasn't going back into her house. When I was 22, my parents asked me to come home and watch my grandma, who had dementia and needed a caregiver, while they went to visit my brother who was living out of the country. 2 days in, my grandma died in her sleep. Not only did I have to deal with being the person who found my grandma dead by myself, but I then had to call all of my various family members, parents, aunts, brothers, to let them know what happened. Edit, I wanted to thank everyone for your kind words and condolences. It's been 10 years since my grandma died, so this is not something I'm grieving over anymore. I will say to the many people who have mentioned being in similar situations, talk to your family, a friend, or someone you trust about any and all feelings you have about an experience like this. For way too many years, yes, years, I blamed myself for my grandma's death and carried it around like a shameful secret. It wasn't until I felt brave enough to tell my mom how I felt that she provided the appropriate perspective and support I needed to finally move on and make peace with that life experience. I had to call my friend's girlfriend to let her know he'd been killed in an accident, and then share that news with his best friend on a pursuant call. Definitely telling my grandmother that her daughter, my mother, had just died. Nothing quite prepares you for telling someone about a death. I had to tell my mom that my dad died. 40 years later I had to tell my kids I had cancer. Cancer. I'm sorry, I should have said I beat it, at least for now. Wow, thank you for silver. So sweet. I had to tell my wife that our 8-year-old son had died in the night. He was on hospice and it was expected, but that was still hard. Then I had to phone my older children and tell them. Thursday will mark 2 years. Professionally, I had to tell the parents of a 20-year-old basketball star that his drug use did not account for his unusual thoughts and behaviors, that he was, in fact, psychotic and likely schizophrenic. My brother, who was active military at the time, had to be granted emergency leave for my mother, who was on her deathbed after a short but destructive battle with cancer. They took more than 24 hours to sign one name on that document to release him, even knowing the circumstances. When he became noticeably upset that they were taking their time with it, they pulled him aside and threatened to make him undergo a psych evaluation for being, understandably, angry. She died while he was on his flight home. I had to tell him over the phone that he missed the passing of our mom and he wouldn't ever be able to say goodbye. That was rough. telling my sister that our dad's heart attack was indeed fatal. When my grandmother passed, we knew it was coming as she had been ill for a very long time. I was at home with my mom when my aunt called with the news that she was gone. My younger sister was at school, so we went to pick her up. When she was called to the office and she saw us there, I think a part of her knew why we came to pick her up, but that didn't make it easier to tell her. I had to tell a doctor that the family decided that it was time to let mom go peacefully. Telling my 4-year-old his papa had died. One Sunday at church, I was walking my baby outside when one of my best friend's mom came up to me. She was in hunting attire and looked to be in complete shock. She told me her husband, my friend's dad, had just fallen out of his tree stand and broken his neck and died, and she asked me to go get her daughter out of church to let her know. It was one of the worst days in my life. When I told my dad that he was in the early stage of dying and was moving to hospice care, he told me, "Oh good," because he was so tired of being sick with Parkinson's. He died 2 weeks later. After my wife woke up from a medically induced coma, I had to tell her our son died. The look of soul-shattering pain still bothers me. I headed up a few departments at my last job, and as DEPT head, I had to be the one to fire people in those departments. It always sucks, even if they are the worst and totally deserve it. Never feels good to take away someone's security. I had to tell my girlfriend that her grandmother had passed away. Her mom called me and asked me to break the news to her, since she's terrible at that stuff. We had only been together about a year and I had to leave work to drive over and tell her. She had just come back from visiting her grandmother a few provinces away a few days earlier, and the doctors said she would be okay. She was so close with her grandmother, I knew it would be devastating to her. It was. She cried for a few hours. I booked her on the next flight home and helped her pack. To this day, something I'll never forget doing. On the plus side, we are still together almost 7 years later and have a beautiful baby girl. I like to think that the moment brought us closer together. Trying to explain to my 4-year-old niece why my longtime girlfriend wasn't with me anymore. She just didn't understand and kept asking questions like, "I thought Auntie _______ loved you. Why did she leave?" The breakup was recent and that conversation hurt, man. My dad was a cop for 27 years, so I asked him. Dad was working the midnight shift. They got a call about a car accident, arrived on the scene to find a fatality. Turns out the guy who was killed was a police officer's son. He was also a close family friend. My dad had to go to one of his best friend and co-worker's house at like 2 a.m. to tell him his son had been struck and killed by a drunk driver. Tell my dad, who had dementia, my mother passed away from cancer. I had to tell my spouse and children that my 26-year-old took his own life. After my parents split up, my dad moved us in with his mother. She was one of those grandmas who woke up every morning to get my siblings and I up for school because my dad left for work at 4 a.m. and worked 12-hour days usually. One day she didn't wake us up. Just as was coming out of my room, I saw my younger, 4YRS, I was 17, coming out of her room. We just kind of looked at each other and had an "oh shit" moment. I went in to check on grandma. She was cold. So I called 911 and then had to call dad. That was hard. And because he worked about 30 minutes away, this was the 90s, so cell phones weren't that common yet, I had to call all the aunts and uncles too. And then dig out grandma's DNR from where dad told me it was and hand it to the EMTs that showed up. So it was definitely the 7 worst calls of my life so far. Edit. Thank you all for the messages of sympathy/condolence, I really appreciate it. For all other replies/comments I'm trying to reply to them as I can. I'm at work right now. A friend of mine at university committed suicide. I ended up sitting down with or calling some of our friends, so the first they heard of it wasn't over Facebook or in the news. 18 months on and it still eats away a bit inside. Bar regular of mine almost fell to his death washing windows in a 4-story building. He miraculously survived yet broke every bone in his body and cracked his skull. First responders were firefighters right near Houston St. and Broadway in NYC. If they hadn't responded, he would have died right there. Fast forward 4 weeks later, September 15, 2001. He is out of his coma, and finally able to be taken home by his sister and out of hospice. Barely able to speak, he manages to whisper that he wants her pass him by the fire station 2 blocks down so he could thank his rescuers. His sister had to then explain the black smoke still lingering in the air, the entirety of the 9/11 attacks, and that every single first responder that helped him, perished. Sometimes that worn-out older man sitting at the bar day drinking red wine has a really good story to tell. Broke my heart.